Texas, 1944. The dust rose in shimmering waves as the bus rattled through the flat horizon, its metal sides echoing with the uneasy silence of captured women. Inside, Lieutenant Hilda Kraus sat rigid, her German uniform faded, but her pride intact. When the camp gates came into view, she expected barbed cruelty, starvation, and hatred. Instead, she saw vegetable gardens, whitewashed barracks, and the faint smell of something warm, sweet, and unfamiliar drifting from the mess hall. It was the scent of baked cornmeal and butter, and though none of them knew it yet, that scent would undo everything they believed about enemies, hunger, and grace. Hilde stepped down from the bus with the discipline of a soldier, still pretending the war could be won. The Texas heat wrapped around her like punishment. She squinted toward the horizon, where the land seemed endless and indifferent. A sergeant in khaki barked orders in English, but his tone was firm rather than cruel. They were counted, inspected, and led to the women's barracks. Simple wooden structures lined with cots and small windows that let in the blinding American Sunday. Everything looked too ordinary to be a prison. At dinner, trays were handed out. She expected thin soup and rationed bread, the kind of sustenance meant to keep prisoners alive but humble. Instead, her eyes caught the square of golden bread on her tray, dense yet soft, its edges glistening with melted butter. "Cornbread," one of the guards said with a faint smile, as if naming something sacred. Hilda frowned. Corn was for livestock, not people. She ignored it, eating only the beans beside it. Around her, the other women muttered, half amused, half suspicious. Across the hall, one prisoner whispered that the Americans were mocking them by feeding them animal food. But the smell lingered sweet, earthy, tender, and something about it tugged at the memory of her mother's kitchen. Before the war, before the ration cards, she clenched her jaw and pushed the thought away. That night, lying on her cot, she could still taste the air from the mess hall, heavy with butter and smoke. Pride kept her hungry, but curiosity whispered like a prayer. What kind of people bake something that smells like kindness for their enemies? Morning arrived like a slow awakening. The sun spilled through the thin curtains of the barracks, washing the wooden floor in light the color of honey. Hilda sat up to the sound of distant hammers and the low murmur of American voices outside. The camp had a rhythm organized but strangely peaceful. She watched through the window as prisoners swept the yard and hung laundry on ropes stretched between posts. Across the fence, an American soldier leaned casually against a jeep, drinking coffee from a tin cup. He wasn't watching them with suspicion, only routine interest, as if this quiet cooperation were normal. The air carried the smell of breakfast, roasted beans, salt, and that same faint sweetness from the night before. Cornbread again, she thought bitterly. The Americans seemed obsessed with it. She tried to remind herself that this was still captivity, no matter how clean or orderly it appeared. Yet, something about the camp unsettled her. The absence of cruelty. There were guards, but they smiled. There were fences, but they didn't shout. Even the food tasted of restraint rather than dominance. When the whistle blew, the women lined up for roll call, the dust soft beneath their boots. A few American nurses walked among them, checking names and distributing soap. One offered Hilda an extra bar, her voice kind but cautious. "For washing, ma'am. Texas gets hot." Hilda took it without thanks, unable to decide whether kindness from an enemy was more humiliating than hatred. As they were led toward the mess hall for breakfast, she kept her chin high, determined to observe rather than participate. Inside, long wooden tables filled the room, already crowded with women murmuring in German. The walls smelled faintly of oil and butter. On each tray sat a piece of golden bread, steam rising from its cracked top. Hilda sat down and stared at it again. The surface was firm, slightly crisp, the inside soft and golden as sunlight. "You won't eat?" asked Anna, the woman seated beside her. She was younger, a tailor from Cologne, with quiet eyes that seemed to study everyone's reactions before revealing her own. "It's American peasant food," Hilda muttered. "Too sweet, too simple. We bake with skill, not with corn." Anna shrugged. "Skill won't keep you warm in a prison camp." She took a careful bite, then another, her expression softening into something dangerously close to delight. Around them, more women tried theirs, and a low hum of surprise moved through the room like wind over tall grass. Some laughed quietly, embarrassed by their pleasure. Hildy felt a flicker of unease. What if this simplicity hid something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by recipe or pride? When the meal ended, she still hadn't touched hers. But as she walked back toward the barracks, the memory of that smell clung to her clothes like a secret. It wasn't the scent of victory or defeat. It was something far more disarming comfort. By late afternoon, the heat pressed down like a living weight. The camp shimmered under a haze of dust, the air thick with the hum of insects and distant shouts from the work crews. Hilda spent the day sorting medical supplies in a storeroom with 2 other prisoners, her hands busy but her thoughts elsewhere. Every time she inhaled, she caught that faint aroma, drifting from the kitchen again, the same warm sweetness that had followed her since arrival. She tried to push it away, to think of home, precision scales and flour dust swirling through the bakery she had managed before the war. But the smell crept in like an unwelcome memory, reminding her that she was no longer in control of her world. When the evening whistle sounded, she wiped her forehead with the edge of her sleeve and joined the slow-moving line toward the mess hall. Inside, the air was heavy with laughter, utensils clinking, and something that felt dangerously close to normal life. The women sat at the long tables, some with hair tied up in neat braids, others sunburned and exhausted from outdoor work. The same dish awaited them: beans, greens, and that golden square of bread. The Americans served it with quiet efficiency, their movements practiced and calm. Hilda took her tray without meeting anyone's eyes. She could feel Anna watching her, waiting. "You will starve before admitting you are curious," Anna teased softly. "I am not curious," Hilda replied, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. At the far end of the room, one of the cooks stood behind a counter, wiping his hands on a towel. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of polished walnut and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had heard the guards call him Sergeant Lewis. When their gazes met briefly, he nodded, once polite, not mocking. Hilda looked away quickly, unsettled by the calmness in his expression. She sat down, stared at the cornbread again, and listened to the women around her whispering about their families, their losses, their disbelief at the generosity of the meals. Some said the Americans were soft. Others said this was strategy to win hearts through comfort. But Hilda felt something deeper, shifting, something she didn't want to name. The first bite came from somewhere nearby. A woman gasped quietly, then covered her mouth. Another laughed under her breath, surprised by her own emotion. The sound spread, small and genuine, echoing through the hall. Hildy's chest tightened. She broke a corner from her own piece without thinking, still pretending it meant nothing. The crumb was warm and tender, the butter soaking into her fingertips. The first taste was light, almost sweet, with a trace of smoke. It melted like memory, simple, perfect, undeserved. For the first time since her capture, she felt something that wasn't defiance or fear. She didn't finish the piece, but she didn't throw it away either. She wrapped it in her napkin, as if saving proof that kindness could exist even in captivity. The next morning, the camp stirred before sunrise, the air still cool enough to breathe without effort. Dew clung to the grass, and from the mess hall chimney, a thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, carrying the unmistakable scent of cornmeal once again. Hilda tried to ignore it as she buttoned her blouse and joined roll call, but her stomach betrayed her with a low growl that made the woman beside her smirk. The routine unfolded as it always did: names, counts, orders, but beneath it all, something had shifted since the previous evening. The women spoke more softly to one another, their faces less guarded, their movements less sharp. Even Hilda noticed that her steps no longer carried the same rigid defiance. Pride had kept her standing tall, but curiosity was beginning to pull her forward in quieter ways. At breakfast, she found herself seated across from Sergeant Lewis, who had been assigned to oversee the kitchen's operations that day. He stood near the serving line, speaking to an American nurse about food inventory. His voice carried the slow rhythm of someone who measured not only ingredients but words. When he noticed Hilda watching, he gave a small nod, respectful but distant. The gesture caught her off guard. She had expected mockery or condescension from her captors, but instead she found an odd dignity in their restraint. Her tray arrived: eggs, beans, and a fresh slice of cornbread that still glistened from melted butter. Anna was already eating, her face serene. "You pretended last night," she said between bites. But you tasted it. Hilda stiffened. It was curiosity, nothing more. Curiosity, Anna murmured, smiling faintly, is the beginning of every change. Hilda looked down at her food, remembering the taste that had startled her the night before. It had reminded her of the bakery in Munich where she once worked as an apprentice, when sweetness came from patience and care rather than wealth. Yet here she was, fed by her supposed enemies, treated with a respect that confused her sense of right and wrong. Sergeant Lewis passed nearby, checking the serving pots. He paused by their table. "You ladies doing all right?" he asked, with a politeness that sounded sincere. Hilda hesitated, then answered in careful English, her accent sharp but controlled. "Your food. It is different." He smiled faintly. "Different good or different bad?" The question lingered like challenge and kindness in equal measure. She could not bring herself to answer honestly, so she looked away. After breakfast, she was assigned to help in the camp's infirmary, organizing bandages and medical logs. The hours passed quietly, but her thoughts stayed fixed on that question. Was it different good or different bad? When the dinner bell rang, she walked toward the hall slower than usual, drawn by the sound of laughter and the smell of cornbread once more. Pride told her to resist, but something softer whispered that perhaps understanding begins not with victory, but with a bite. By evening, the heat had loosened its grip on the camp, and a soft wind carried the scent of rain and smoke across the barracks. Hilda sat on the wooden step outside her quarters, her hands resting on her knees, watching the sky turn the color of copper. Around her, the other women murmured quietly, some writing letters they knew would never be sent, others mending uniforms or simply staring toward the horizon. The day had been long, filled with inventory work and endless counting, but beneath the exhaustion ran something new, a restless curiosity that none of them dared name. When the dinner bell rang, the women rose, brushing dust from their skirts, and filed toward the mess hall. Inside, the familiar smell greeted them before they saw the food. The air was thick with butter and something faintly sweet, like roasted grain. Tonight's trays held beans, boiled greens, and 2 golden squares of cornbread. The sound of forks on tin plates filled the room, steady and human. Hilda sat near the end of the table, trying to maintain composure as Anna took a large bite beside her. "It tastes better each time," Anna said softly, her voice almost reverent. "The edges are crisp, but the middle melts like sugar." Hilda frowned, but said nothing. Across the room, Sergeant Lewis stood near the ovens, speaking quietly with the kitchen staff. When his eyes met hers, he nodded once in greeting before returning to his work. There was no mockery in his expression, no trace of triumph, only quiet pride in the craft of feeding others. Without quite knowing why, Hilda tore a small piece from her cornbread and brought it to her lips. The flavor unfolded slowly, warm, buttery, balanced between sweet and salty. She closed her eyes for a moment. It was not the complexity of German baking, but something simpler, something that spoke of home in a language older than pride. She took another bite, and the noise of the room seemed to fade around her. For the first time since her capture, she felt full not only in body, but in spirit. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. She looked down quickly, hoping no one had noticed, but Anna had. "You understand now," she whispered. "It's not the food, it's the kindness in it." After dinner, Hilda lingered as the others left, watching the kitchen crew clean their stations. The rhythmic scrape of pans and quiet laughter of the Americans echoed softly. Sergeant Lewis wiped his hands on a towel, glanced at her, and smiled faintly. "See you tomorrow, ma'am," he said gently, as if addressing an equal. Hilda managed a nod before stepping into the evening air. The sky was deep blue now, stars beginning to emerge, and the faint warmth of cornbread still clung to her fingertips. For the first time, captivity didn't feel like punishment, it felt like awakening. Rain came before dawn, a quiet, steady rhythm against the tin roofs that softened the camp into silence. Hilda woke to the scent of wet earth and the faint sweetness of corn lingering in her memory like a dream she wasn't ready to lose. The barracks felt unusually calm that morning. No one argued over chores or complained about the heat. The women moved slowly, their conversations hushed, as if the sound of rain demanded reverence. When the roll call ended, the guards announced that outdoor work would be cancelled until the storm passed. Instead, several prisoners, Hilda among them, were assigned to the kitchen to assist with preparations. The news stirred an odd mix of dread and curiosity inside her. She had not entered a kitchen since her capture, not even to wash a dish. The idea of cooking under the supervision of her captors felt humiliating. Yet, a quiet part of her longed to see where that impossible scent was born. The mess hall kitchen was larger than she imagined. Rows of metal counters, stacked pots, and sacks of grain lined neatly against the walls. Steam fogged the windows, and in the center of it all stood Sergeant Lewis, sleeves rolled, stirring something thick and golden in a large bowl. "Morning, ladies," he greeted with the calm assurance of someone who had said those words 1,000 times before. His tone was patient, not commanding. "We're baking for 200 today. Keep your hands clean and your minds open." The phrase startled Hilda. It sounded less like an order and more like an invitation. She joined a table where Anna and 2 others were measuring flour. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of butter and salt. Lewis moved between them, explaining the process: how the cornmeal needed the right balance of buttermilk and egg, how too much sugar turned the bread to cake, how heat alone didn't make something rise, timing and care did. Hilda found her hands remembering movements long forgotten, folding, mixing, smoothing. It felt almost sacred, this act of creating instead of destroying. Lewis noticed her precision and smiled. "You've done this before," he said. She nodded without looking up. "In Hamburg, before the war." "Then you already know," he replied, "that good food don't care where it's made or who makes it." The words landed heavier than he intended. She looked at him, the steam blurring the distance between them. Something inside her shifted, a quiet breaking of the invisible wall she had built around herself. When the first batch came out of the oven, the scent filled every corner of the kitchen. The women paused, silent, as Lewis lifted a piece and handed it to her. "Go on, ma'am. Taste it fresh." Hilda hesitated, then took a bite. The warmth spread through her like forgiveness. "It's perfect," she whispered. He nodded. Sometimes the best things are simple. For the first time, she believed him. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky washed clean and bright. Puddles mirrored the clouds, and the air smelled of wet grass and ash from the kitchen fires. Hilda stood outside the mess hall, her sleeves rolled, hands dusted in cornmeal. She had spent the morning baking under Sergeant Lewis's patient instruction, and though exhaustion tugged at her, a quiet pride warmed her chest. The other women teased her lightly as they passed. "Our German officer turned baker," Anna called with a grin. Hilda smiled despite herself. The sound of laughter in a place meant for prisoners felt almost rebellious, a small act of life against the memory of war. She carried a tray of cooling bread to the serving tables, the golden pieces lined neatly in rows. They smelled of butter and smoke, and for a moment she could almost imagine she was back in her family's bakery before the sirens and rubble changed everything. When the lunch bell rang, the hall filled quickly. German prisoners and American staff sat across from one another, separated not by hostility but by habit. Lewis stood near the serving counter, arms crossed, watching as the women served the bread they had baked. His eyes found Hilda's, and he gave a single approving nod. She felt an unexpected rush of emotion, something that was neither gratitude nor shame, but a strange mixture of both. Across the table, Anna broke her bread in half, the crust flaking apart in soft crumbs. "Taste this," she urged the woman beside her. "It's ours this time." The statement struck Hilda deeply. Ours, not theirs, not the enemy's, something shared. A murmur spread through the room as more of the women tasted the bread. Some closed their eyes, others whispered blessings they hadn't spoken in years. The hall, usually filled with metallic echoes, softened under the sound of quiet chewing and gentle conversation. For the first time, it did not feel like a camp. It felt like a gathering. When the meal ended, Lewis addressed them from the counter. "You all did good work today. Real good. Food's meant to bring people together, not apart." His words hung in the air like smoke, sinking into every heart that still knew hunger. Later that evening, as the sun lowered behind the fences, Hilda lingered by the doorway of the kitchen, watching the last trays being cleaned. "You taught us more than baking today," she said softly. Lewis looked up from the sink. "And you learned faster than most," he replied. "You've got steady hands and a serious heart. That's all good cooking needs." She didn't know how to thank him, so she nodded instead, holding the last piece of warm cornbread between her palms. She took a bite as she stepped outside. The taste was the same as before, sweet, tender, and undeserved, but this time it didn't make her cry. It made her understand. The next week brought a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Mornings began with roll call and ended with the smell of baking cornmeal drifting across the yard. The women who once scoffed at American food now volunteered eagerly for kitchen duty, their laughter echoing through the camp like the sound of rain after drought. Hilda found herself waking early, not from duty, but anticipation. She had come to love the still hour before dawn, when the ovens were lit and the world smelled of butter and smoke. Working beside Sergeant Lewis had become a quiet ritual, their communication reduced to glances and gestures that carried more trust than words. There was no hierarchy in the kitchen, no officers or prisoners, only hands measuring, stirring, kneading, and waiting. In those moments, Hilda felt like something fragile inside her was mending. One morning, as she whisked batter in a wide tin bowl, Lewis spoke without looking up. "You ever think about what you'll do when this is over?" She paused, the question heavy in its simplicity. "Go home, I suppose," she said, "if there is still a home left." He nodded slowly. "You'll have a lot to teach when you do. Folks everywhere need people who can make something from almost nothing." She watched him pour batter into the pans with the precision of a craftsman. "You mean baking?" she asked. "I mean kindness," he said. "Food just makes it easier to see." The words caught her off guard. She wanted to argue, to remind him they were enemies, that kindness was weakness. But she couldn't. Not after tasting proof to the contrary every day. When the first batch of cornbread emerged golden from the oven, the scent filled the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Hilda leaned over the tray, inhaling deeply. "You always smell it before you taste it," Lewis said. "That's how you know it's ready." She smiled faintly, realizing how often she had judged things she never tried. That evening, she wrote in her small notebook, a habit she had rediscovered since working in the kitchen. Her handwriting trembled as she formed the words. "Today I understood that simplicity is not the absence of skill, it is the mastery of patience. Americans bake not to impress, but to share." She hesitated, then added, "Perhaps I was wrong about more than food." After dinner, she walked outside, the sky burning red over the fields beyond the fences. The smell of fresh cornbread still clung to her sleeves. A group of prisoners sang softly in German near the laundry line, their voices blending with the chirping of crickets. The camp no longer felt like an island of defeat, but a strange kind of refuge. For the first time since the war began, Hilda allowed herself to imagine a future that did not depend on victory, only on understanding. And somewhere deep inside, she realized that every piece of bread she baked was one small rebellion against the world that had taught her to hate. Winter crept slowly into Texas, softening the air but sharpening the mornings. Frost glazed the edges of the fences, and the camp awoke each day beneath a pale silver light. Hilda had grown used to the rhythm of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of butter, the scent of rising bread, but on this morning there was an unease that sat heavy in her chest. A letter from home had arrived the night before, written in her sister's trembling hand. The words were brief, smudged, and full of hunger. Their mother was gone. The bakery in Hamburg had been destroyed in an air raid. The ovens that once filled their street with warmth were now buried under ash. Hilda had read the letter 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it beneath her pillow. She had not wept. Pride still held her upright, even as grief hollowed her from within. When she entered the kitchen that morning, Lewis immediately noticed the change in her. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. "Germany is starving," she said. "My family has nothing left." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Then everything you learn here matters even more." She frowned. "How can mixing flour and corn help anyone there?" He wiped his hands on a towel, his voice steady. "Because someday, people like you will rebuild what war tried to burn. You'll know how to make simple food taste like hope." The phrase lingered between them. She turned back to the counter, her throat tightening. They worked in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of spoons against metal bowls. Later, as the first trays came from the oven, Hilda carried one carefully to the cooling racks. The golden squares steamed against the chill air. She thought of her sister's letter, of empty cupboards and blackened chimneys, and something inside her finally broke. Without warning, tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and relentless. She pressed her palms to her face, ashamed of her weakness, but Louis was beside her in an instant. He said nothing, only placed a clean cloth on the counter within reach. "You cry because you care," he said softly. "That's what keeps the good in you alive." She took the cloth and nodded, unable to speak. When evening came, she brought a small piece of cornbread back to her barrack. She sat on her cot, staring at it in her hands before wrapping it carefully in paper. "For my sister," she whispered, even though the bread would never reach her. She placed it under her pillow beside the letter, a quiet promise she could not yet fulfill. As she lay down, the scent of corn and butter filled the small room, and for the first time she prayed not for victory or freedom, but for the strength to feed the hungry when the war finally ended. Christmas arrived quietly, wrapped in the soft chill of Texas winter and the faint scent of pine branches someone had hung above the mess hall door. The Americans called it decoration duty, but to the German prisoners it felt like a small mercy, a reminder of the world that existed before uniforms and fences. Hilda stood at the counter beside Sergeant Lewis as dawn broke, both of them covered in flour. The camp command had decided on a shared Christmas meal, turkey, beans, and trays of cornbread, baked fresh that morning. The ovens glowed like hearths, and for a moment the kitchen no longer felt like a place of labor, but a sanctuary. "You'll lead the baking today," Lewis said, handing her a spoon with mock ceremony. "You know the recipe better than I do now." She tried to smile. "Then I suppose the student has surpassed the teacher." "Not yet," he replied, "but you're close." The women worked in rhythm, measuring, stirring, and laughing quietly under their breath. Anna hummed a German carol as she mixed batter, and soon the Americans joined in with their own tune. The melodies collided awkwardly at first, then blended into something oddly beautiful, two languages speaking the same hope. When the bread came from the oven, golden and steaming, Hilda brushed the tops with butter. The smell filled the air like a blessing. Outside, the prisoners lined up for the meal, their breath visible in the cold. The Americans served side by side with them, handing out generous portions without a trace of mockery. When Hilda stepped to the serving table, she caught sight of the faces beyond the line, men and women, guards and captives, all sharing the same hunger, the same fatigue, the same fragile need for something human. At the table, Anna whispered, "It tastes even better today." Hilda nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Around them, laughter rose softly, mingling with the clink of utensils. Some women closed their eyes while chewing, as if trying to remember this moment forever. One of the American cooks began to pray aloud, his voice steady but emotional. He thanked God for peace, even among enemies, for food, and for mercy undeserved. The room fell silent. Hilda bowed her head without meaning to, her eyes burning. She thought of her mother's prayers in the bakery, of bread rising in warm ovens while snow fell outside. The memory struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. After the meal, as dusk settled, she lingered near the kitchen door, watching the Americans clean up. Louis turned toward her. "Good bread brings people together," he said quietly. She looked at the remaining crumbs on the counter and nodded. "Yes," she answered, "even those who once believed they could never share a table." The sound of carols drifted from the barracks. For the first time since her capture, she did not feel like a prisoner. She felt like someone being forgiven. The war ended the following spring, but for Hilda, the news arrived like an echo from a distant world. The camp remained quiet, almost reverent, as rumors spread through the barracks. Germany had surrendered. The empire that once promised greatness was gone, and what remained were its children scattered across the world, hungry and uncertain. Hilda stood by the fence that morning, watching the American flag ripple in the soft wind. She had imagined this moment countless times: freedom, victory, return, but none of her fantasies matched the hollow ache she felt now. Around her, the other women wept or stared in stunned silence. Anna clutched her arm. "We're going home," she whispered. Hilda nodded, though she wasn't sure what home meant anymore. In the kitchen, Sergeant Lewis worked quietly, stirring a pot on the stove. The scent of cornbread, mixed with the sharper aroma of coffee, filling the air with a bittersweet warmth. "So," he said when Hildy entered, "looks like the war's over." She leaned against the counter, her eyes distant. It feels strange to hear it said out loud. He nodded slowly. "Most endings do." She glanced at him, trying to find words. "What happens to us now?" "You'll be processed, sent back when they're ready," he answered. "Some might stay. Depends on the paperwork, depends on the heart." His tone was gentle, but she caught the meaning behind his words. Stay. The idea unsettled her. "Germany needs rebuilding," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "And people who know how to build," he added, handing her a wooden spoon. "You already proved you can." They spent the rest of the morning baking, side by side, in a silence that felt both final and tender. When the last tray cooled, Louis cut a small piece and placed it in her hand. "For the road," he said. The bread was warm, buttery, familiar. "For the future," she corrected quietly. He smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "Then make it count." That evening, the prisoners gathered for one final meal. The Americans had prepared it themselves, no ceremony, no speeches, only food. Cornbread, beans, greens, and coffee. The same meal that had marked the beginning of everything. As Hilda looked around the room, she saw faces transformed. Women who had once sneered now laughed freely. Guards who had once stood apart now shared tables. The air was filled with a strange peace, fragile but real. When her turn came to speak, she rose slowly. "When we arrived," she said, "we thought we understood who we were and who you were. But you taught us something we never expected, that decency can survive war. That kindness can come from those we called enemies." She lifted her piece of cornbread, her voice trembling. "This small bread changed me. It reminded me what it means to be human." The room was silent for a heartbeat, then filled with the quiet sound of applause, gentle, respectful, and full of understanding. Weeks later, the transport trucks arrived. Rows of women stood with their few belongings, ready to leave the camp that had once felt like a prison, but had somehow become something closer to a memory of safety. Hilda held her small satchel close, the same one she had carried since capture. Inside, it was the last letter from her sister, a folded recipe card Louis had written for her, and a single piece of cornbread wrapped carefully in cloth. The Americans called out names, checking lists, their voices steady but subdued. There was no triumph, no bitterness, only quiet respect between those who had lived through something that words could not truly explain. When Louis appeared at the gate, she almost didn't recognize him without his apron. He carried a small tin box in his hands. "For you," he said. "A few ingredients: flour, sugar, cornmeal, enough to start again." She blinked back tears, unable to speak. "Thank you," she finally whispered, "for everything." He gave a small nod. "You earned it, ma'am. Every crumb." The bus ride toward the coast was long and silent. Outside, the Texas plains stretched endlessly, bathed in early summer light. The air smelled of grass and freedom, but Hildy's heart felt heavier with every mile. She thought of the women beside her, Anna asleep against the window, others lost in thought, and wondered where their paths would lead. Home was now a word without walls, scattered across the ashes of a country that no longer existed. Yet inside her sat a quiet determination. She had learned something in captivity that no war could destroy: the art of starting small, of making beauty from scarcity. Days later, when they reached the ship bound for Europe, the women lined up to board. Hilda turned one last time toward the shore. She could almost see the camp in her mind, the ovens glowing, the laughter, the scent of corn in the air. It had been a place of contradictions, of fear and grace woven together. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I will remember." Months passed before she found her way back to Hamburg. The city lay in ruins, a skeleton of streets she once knew by heart. Yet amid the rubble, people were rebuilding, women sweeping debris, men hammering boards across broken windows, children scavenging bricks to form new walls. Hilda joined them quietly, setting up a small stall near the train station with the few supplies she had left. On the first morning, she baked what she could: rough loaves of cornbread, soft inside, golden on the edges. The smell drifted through the cold air, drawing a small crowd. When the first customer asked, "What is this?" she smiled faintly. "Something I learned from an American soldier," she said. "It tastes like hope." And as the first piece was shared, steaming in the hands of a stranger, Hilda felt the war finally end, not with surrender, but with the simple act of breaking bread. If this story moved you, remember what it truly shows, that even in the ruins of war, compassion can rise from the smallest acts of kindness. One shared meal can turn enemies into teachers, and a single taste can change the way we see one another forever. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of humanity, humility, and hope, where rations became revelations and food became the language of peace.